Hello there again, everybody. We're going to move into a new era of American history. We just moved out of the roaring 20s, and I think I made it clear, or at least I hope I did, early on that the sense of prosperity that we had in the early mid 20s was pretty much a facade. You peel it back and there were some problems. But now what we're going to look at is the Great Depression, its causes, and some of its effects. And this is going to be a relatively short lecture, but there's a relatively long one that I will be posting later. And there's some overlap there, and that's just it's one of those. I want to make sure that you get the gist of this time period. So as we look at it, when you look at the Depression, we have to look at the long-term causes first. This just didn't happen overnight, and there are five major things that we're going to need to deal with. One of those is weak industry. And if you go back, one of the questions on your quiz talked about how the Model T and how it was, what its impact was. But you don't usually think of weak industry in the 1920s, but we kind of have to now. Because when you look at it, industry is not just making cars or things like that, but the cotton industry, especially here in North Carolina, is affected by the rise of synthetic materials like Dacron polyester. And so all of a sudden, there's not the need for all of this cotton production that the South's economy is still in so many ways based on. Railroads are adversely affected by the automobile. It's, trucks and things like that allow us to transport goods, in a much different way. It allows us to transport people in a much different way. Each day I get in my truck and I drive to Hickory and run a school. I don't get on a train, or if we go to my wife's parents in Pittsburgh, we don't generally get on a train. We get in her car and we drive up. And so to us, you look at this idea of railroads, it's like, what in the devil? Well, railroads were the thing before the automobile, and now they're taking one of the major American industries. It's kind of taking it on the chin until World War II. And then you look at low food prices. I wish we had those again in some ways, but it affects the farming industry. If food prices are low, then food manufacturers are not paying farmers much money for their products. And so you get this industry that's relatively weak. If you're a consumer, it's pretty cool because you have new materials, you've got the automobile, you've got low food prices, but what it's doing to the underlying structure of the economy is not great. Then you look back and we talked about the overproduction of durable goods during the 1920s. The American industry is producing more than it can ever sell. And so what you see by the end of the 20s, we're spending less on things. The consumer credit is tapped out. You don't have enough money to keep buying these big ticket items. It's kind of like the old housing bubble we had, a couple of times in our lives. And it doesn't matter how young you really are, you've seen it at least twice. And so that's going on. So we've got overproduction. We've got a weak industry. You're talking about warehouses full of things that can't be sold. That doesn't do good for a company. Then you look at income distribution, where you have 5% of the population receiving about 30% of the total income. We keep hearing these things in this particular election cycle, but in the 1920s, they're palpable. You can talk low wages for industrial workers and farmers. Absolutely. You look at the two things above here, the two blocks above, and it makes a lot of sense why those wages are low. And so you look at that the number three there, when half of the country lives below the poverty line, you've got yourself some trouble. As bad as the economy may or may not have been over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years that I've been alive for, we've never seen anything like this, even at its worst. But then you roll it up into banking, and banking becomes fun. There's a lot of speculation in banking, which means there was a lot of money to be made. So they're investing it in some very volatile things. And we're going to see some of that in just a moment. And you've got some mismanagement. It's like, you should not give me a loan for $1 million. I'm in education. You can't pay it back. But they're doing some very shady things that are right on the edge, and it's going to come back by banking in the rear end. But then also you've got the concept of too big to fail, like Bank of America down in Charlotte, where you've got roughly 1% of the banks in America controlling about 46% of all bank reserves, which means there's a very few that control a whole lot. You pump that into that income distribution where you have a very few that control a whole lot, and you've got a mess on your hands in America. And then we throw in the wild card of the international economy. In America, remember, we talked about them throwing tariffs on things. Well, that's that protectionist trade policy. And Americans, we don't want the cheap foreign goods, or at least that's what we're saying. So we're going to throw this tariff on there. Boom. So other countries can't sell things here. And if they can't sell it here, where are they going to sell it? They're not. And that causes a problem. 1930, and I know the Great Depression's already been going on for roughly 9 months to a year at that time. The Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act creates the highest tariff in American history. And if you've seen the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, you've actually seen the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, where Ben Stein's going, anyone, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, anyone raised or lowered, anyone raised tariffs in America sank deeper into the Great Depression. He's right. Okay, and Ben Stein has got a good of an economics background, but that's neither here nor there. You crank up that tariff that high, other countries are going to do the same to America. Okay, so we're actually hurting the international economy. How was it? 23 countries there retaliate by imposing import tariffs against American goods. Folks, you got yourself a problem. And the problem comes. No, not when the Hindenburg blows up at Lakehurst, New Jersey, which is pretty cool. The thing comes on Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. What's that, 70 and 20? 91 years ago last week. It's just when something happens. It kind of, we consider it the trigger of the Great Depression or the start of it. It's really not the trigger. It's more like a symptom of the things that I've just said. And one of the newspapers had a big old headline, Wall Street lays an egg. And so that's what happens. This is the big giant Wall Street sell-off. When people begin to sell off their stocks and other securities like that, and about $25 billion is lost in a month. Now, it does today. I mean, the federal government can spend that tomorrow and not blink an eye. But in 1929, that's a huge amount of money. That's an American economy taking a massive hit or exploding just like the Hindenburg that I have up here in the top right. So there's two things. What leads to that? Something called buying on the margin. This is scary. And buying on the margin means that what you do, instead of paying the full price for a stock, you only pay a percentage. And you pay a percentage, and you're betting that the price will go up or the value is going to go up. And then you can sell it at some point in the near future, recoup the money that you still owe, and make a little bit of profit. But the problem was people leveraged so much of their cash into this and their reserves that what ends up happening is when the margin gets called and the stock is actually dropped, people start to go belly up. And then make that even worse. This speculation, banks would loan money for you to do this with. Tell me how deadly of a gamble that is. I mean, that's like some Las Vegas style junk right there. So when you get that going, that's what helps fuel that stock market that's growing and growing and growing and growing like a balloon. And eventually we all know that it's got to pop. And so these things are intertwined. Okay, 5% down. I couldn't remember the number. I knew I had it on here. 5% down. Folks, you can barely buy a house that way today. And you know a house is going to be there. You don't know if a stock is. And they're loaning that money. And people get confident in that bull market because everybody's making money. And so they think, why can't I make some money too? Which is the wrong thing to have. And it starts to swing, whoosh, whoosh, back and forth, back and forth. And finally, on October 29th, 1929, the whole thing explodes. Or as we said in southern Cleveland County growing up, it blowed up. So what happens here? There's an impact. You darn straight. Is it the immediate cause of the depression? Nope, just a symptom. But it does set in motion a ripple. And that one is hard to deny. And that ripple is all of a sudden as this money evaporates, as this wealth evaporates, as this capital evaporates, it creates a very shaky foundation for the American economy. So in that sense, the crash kind of ushers it in, or officially ushers in what people should have seen coming for at least a year, if not more. So what are some of the effects of it? Well, number one, these banks that have all this money tied up, they begin to fail. 5,700 banks. 22%, or I've always called that roughly 1 out of 5. And unlike today, where you have the FDIC or the different little versions of that program that protect your money if the bank goes under, back then, if your money it went under, it's gone. Your money is gone. See, fortunately, I'm not very wealthy, so I wouldn't lose much. Okay, but when that savings is lost, what have you just done to families, millions across this country? You've created a massive economic problem, okay, a devastating problem. All right, so move along. So that leads us to business failures. In 1929, approximately 20,000, that's our best figure. We're not real sure of the exact number, go under. Then by 1932, you've got 30,000. Folks, there's not that many in America. I mean, there's more than this, obviously, but you're looking at huge percentages. We don't know that percentage, okay? So then, all of that leads to unemployment. It's well over 25%. In the next lecture, I'm going to show you what I think it was, what most economists now think it was. But 25% or higher, we have never seen that except during the great COVID pandemic. Okay, and we knew it was temporary. This is a permanent unemployment, or permanent over the course of years. Okay, if you lived in a city, it was higher than in the country. The unskilled workers are always the most vulnerable. They're always the most susceptible. It's kind of like these days, what is unemployment for people with a college degree? It's really low. Now, you may be underemployed, but you're not unemployed. And so what happens to these unskilled workers, these are not even high school, people with high school diploma. They're worse than that. They don't have skills that translate into other higher grossing employment. So they're the most susceptible, but they're the first ones to go. Farmers are also hit hard because banks start to call in their loans. There's something called a recall provision, and it does not exist today. Like if you buy a house, we bought our house a couple years ago. Actually, us and the State Employees Credit Union bought it. And for the next God knows how long, me and my wife have to pay each month. We pay a set amount plus interest. That interest is what prevents the bank from doing this, because we pay the interest along the way. Whereas back in the day, the way it's been explained to me from my banker is back then during the recall provision, your interest was computed much differently. And so like during the Depression, there may be a clause in your bank loan that says, hey, you're going to pay X amount for so many years, but then if we want to, we can tell you've got 3 months to pay up the principal, or else we get to take your whatever collateral, in most cases, the home. This is a problem. Today we don't do it that way. Back then it was. So farmers are getting hit. They're losing their farms all over the place. One of the books that you can read for your book review is The Grapes of Wrath, which starts off with this very scenario. All right, and so then you got wage drops. So if you still have a job, your wages are cut, which is better to have something than nothing. But you look at that number, 41%. Oh man, that is huge. You cut my wages by 41%, and well, the State Employees Credit Union is going to get this house back. Okay, that's just the way it works, and that's what's going on in America at that time. And so it slows the entire economic cycle. If I have money in my pocket, extra money, typically that extra money gets spent. Same thing happened back then. There's nothing new to that. But now that those wages are cut by that much, man, that's less money in circulation. That's less money being spent, which further causes business failures, bank failures, leads to higher unemployment. It's a humongous and vicious cycle. So what else? Again, farmers are losing their jobs, roughly a fourth due to those drops. It's unreal. And so when I see depression here, and I hate that this thing, sometimes when you convert from Keynote to PowerPoint, it does this weird stuff. But depression here, I'm not talking about the Great Depression. I'm talking about Prozac, Lexapro depression. There is a huge psychological trauma to this. People that were wealthy one week are not the other. Oh, what was that silly movie? Jack and Rose. Oh, the Titanic, where her old nasty old supposed to be husband said that during the crash that something happened to his affairs, that he was wiped out and he killed himself. It happens. There is true mental depression as a result of this. Families begin to break up. If you have seen, oh my goodness, what is that movie where Russell Crowe, he's a boxer, Cinderella Man, that's it, where they break the family up. And Part of it's because they can't afford to have the children. I mean, you have fathers leaving. I mean, you have mothers abandoning the family. This is a god-awful, horrible time. You have a rise of people being hobos, which is the term they would have used. You have people living in public parks making shacks out of pieces of scrap wood and cardboard and tar paper, and they called them Hoovervilles after the president of the time. Oh, come on, click. There we go. And lastly, there's devastation. And I'm talking economic devastation, psychological devastation. Our gross national product drops by 40%. Folks, that's huge. The economy just shrank by almost half. Now, if I could do that with my waistline, I've got a good day going. But you don't in terms of the economy. In America, I put it here, America's the hardest hit. I think we kind of have to look at it that way from our perspective. Even though across the world it's going to be ugly, in Europe, especially in Germany, which is going to help give rise to good old Adolf. And I say that tongue in cheek, good old. But in America, it's going to be hit the hardest from our perspective. As a matter of fact, President Hoover says the darn thing was imported, that somebody tried to give it to us. Okay? And what happens is the whole international debt structure collapses. And that gives rise to a lot of chaos in financial markets and dealing with reparations from Germany and all of that, and helps give rise, like I said, to Adolf Hitler. So, you're the President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, self-made man. You know, you made yourself into a millionaire, and how are you going to respond? Now, I've got a picture of Hoover Dam there, but he's got a philosophy. In the philosophy, he says that this whole thing is imported, and that if we'll just let it run its course like a virus, which is always my analogy, that it's going to go away and we're going to be all right. He says it's not our system that needs repair, it's the international system. And the bad thing is, taken from an impartial view from the 21st century, he's probably right. But you don't get to stay president when you say, hey, we're going to let it run its course. Sorry you're living in the cold. Sorry you lost your life savings. Sorry you've lost everything. We're going to let it run its course. That's not what Americans are going to listen to. So we talked about farming. You know, he tried to set up these co-ops. So listen, we're going to buy up the stuff, keep the prices relatively high. You know, we're going to store these commodities and we're going to sell them when the time's right. He tries to do things that nobody has ever seen before. Hoover's going to get characterized as doing very little and as an old laissez-faire guy. Remember the laissez-faire from back at the turn of the 20th century? Hoover is of that era, and he's going to get painted with that brush. But what you see here simply in farming is unlike anything, any type of government intervention that America has seen before. And here it is, Herbert Hoover's doing it. And tariffs, you know, we talk about the Hawley Smoot, you know, raising the Tariff Act. And he's going to declare economic war on the rest of the world. And all of a sudden, our trade deficits begin to widen and our depression worsens because they're setting up the tariffs on us. So Hoover's trying. He's trying protectionism. He's trying government intervention for farmers. We're going to let this thing run its course, then we can go back to the way it was. But it doesn't work as fast as he would like. So there's some public works. He says, listen, I want these businesses, you need to not lay people off. You need to pay them a wage. You need to do this, even though it's costing you money, much like Lowe's Home Improvement's doing during this COVID crisis. Okay? He said, listen, this is what it means to be. You want America to come back? Here's what you have to do. Things like the Boulder Dam and other highways, these public works, humongous government projects that nobody in the 1920s would have been like, no Republicans would have been like, hey, here's what we need to do. This is a massive response, even though it doesn't quite get covered the way it should. All right? And then there's the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. He says, listen, who do Americans work for? Big business. So we're going to loan money to big business, and we're going to loan money to banks to keep them open, to keep them solvent, to keep them hiring people. Great idea on paper. It's LGOP. Looks good on paper. But if you're one of the people living in a Hooverville down by the Washington Monument, it looks like just, some other chance for all these cronies to give their buddies money. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. What does it do? The Reconstruction Finance Corporation actually prevents firms from going out of business. And if they went out of business, it would have hurt the economy even worse. But it just doesn't look right to the average person. Then Hoover shoots himself in the foot again by coming up with this concept known as rugged individualism. And what he says is basically, he doesn't say this per se, but the belief is that if we hand you something, we give you something for nothing, that's going to create laziness. Kind of like in the national parks, you'll see signs that says don't feed the animals because they become dependent on it. And that's what he says will happen. That if we give people direct relief, they will become lazy and dependent. I think that's giving it a very simplistic explanation to what is an incredibly complex problem. But Hoover is a self-made man. He pulled himself up by the bootstraps. And what he says, though, is that every person should take care of themselves. You take care of your family. And if that happens, we're going to be okay. Well, there is some logic and some merit in this, but that's not what you're wanting to hear if you're living out on the street and lost everything. And he says, oh, there should be a moratorium on all this debt, blah, blah, blah. So that's Hoover's response, which is more government intervention than anybody has ever seen in American history, and it's simply not enough. So what we need to do now for just a moment is evaluate Hoover. And the question is, was he at fault? Did he cause the Depression? Now, I've got a question mark here, but the real answer is no, he didn't. There's no way one president can do that. It's like when you see presidents take credit for an economy or get blamed for one. It's not truly their fault. This thing is so big that it turns like the Titanic and not like a Ferrari. So the next one was he right? Rugged individualism, and it was imported, and it's going to run its course. Again, you get another question mark. Why? Because we don't know, because it didn't play out that way. And then the last question is, did he do enough? We know he's done more than any president in history up to that point. Remember Calvin Coolidge? He wouldn't help farmers that were flooded by the Mississippi. He said, you knew the river was there. But again, you get the question mark, because did he do enough? It depends on your perspective. But what we do know is that Herbert Hoover, for his day and inside of his party, was probably considered relatively liberal. Why? He ran deficits. America didn't run deficits at that time. He spent more money than the government had. Today, we love it. But he wanted to jumpstart that economy. And here's the thing, you notice it's got a big old exclamation point. He probably did keep it from being worse, which is almost unfathomable in the way that we tend to view the Great Depression. But also, the idea of government involvement more than any president to that time. And truly, he paves the way for the New Deal, because he put that government involvement by little bites and little chunks, and all of a sudden when FDR throws it off by the bucket full, it becomes much more palatable. So what we get is the election of 1932. You got Hoover on the left, you got FDR on the right. So what you get, FDR. And he says, I pledge to you, I pledge to America a New Deal, which becomes kind of that rallying cry that we know it is. It was kind of an offhand remark. He's just a man who kind of kept it on the forefront. Or it's his brain trust who does that. He said he would give us a balanced budget. One of his campaign slogans was out of the red with Roosevelt. Saying that Hoover was being fiscally irresponsible. Well, we know, looking from the 21st century, Roosevelt ran all kinds of deficits, all kinds of government involvement, but that was his pledge to, or his promise to America, is a balanced budget. Out of the red with Roosevelt. But he says he's going to give direct relief to who he called the forgotten man. And here is where he and Hoover are going to greatly differ in their philosophy and what is, I think, an incredible amount of genius on the part of Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt, most of us know, was crippled from polio. And he could stand and he could walk a little bit, but usually he was in a wheelchair. And he was not that way most of his life. Most of his life, he was a very robust individual, a very, very powerful athlete in so many ways. And early after the end of World War I, he had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, much like distant cousin Teddy Roosevelt. And he had gone for a swim at the family country estate. And he came in, he was tired, and he went to sleep. And he woke up and was paralyzed. And it's actually a case of polio. And he would say a little bit later as he became a very national political figure, that having polio and not being able to use his legs made him empathize with people who did not have or could not do. And so the New Deal probably comes from what was his worst physical affliction, and that was not being able to walk, but it gave him great empathy. So he's going to promise that direct relief for the common man. And they also want to repeal the prohibition because, frankly, it just didn't work. So how about Hoover in 32? He says, listen, man, we're going to have the higher tariffs. We want to stay on the gold standard, which limits the amount of money that a particular economy can have. Roosevelt's going, we need to get off the gold standard. We need to be able to print money. We need to be able to pump this economy into action. During the election, what does Hoover do? He stays in the White House. He says, I'm staying here. I'm not campaigning. I'm staying here to work on the country's problems. We don't have time for campaigning and politics. In a lot of ways, it's a very good thing. But at the time, it was probably not the most insightful thing to do as a politician. And he was also incredibly defensive in tone. And by that, I mean, he was defensive and people were blaming him for the Depression. And he's going, it wasn't my fault. I didn't do this, blah, blah, blah. I'm trying to do the best I can. And nobody wants to hear a defensive politician. It's kind of like listen to Nick Saban talk about if his team didn't play good or something. But he always stood by free enterprise. He said, this thing works. He says, you're going to have ups, you're going to have downs, but it works in the long term. But that's not what people wanted to hear. So what happens is Franklin Roosevelt does win. And look at his electoral landslide. It is huge. We're going to hear a lot about that on Tuesday night. This one is a legitimate one. The popular vote was closer than we really like to think. We think that Roosevelt comes in like a conquering Roman emperor, just here he is. No, the popular vote was very close because Roosevelt is relatively radical and success was not that far in the rearview mirror. But something happens in 32. African Americans abandon the party of Lincoln and they switch and become Democrats, something that has not, on the whole, has not changed since then. Then there's going to be the bonus army fiasco. I'm going to talk about that in a little while later. It includes a guy by the name of Douglas MacArthur that we're really going to hear about later. I'm going to include that on the next lecture. So there's a lame duck period. Today, if a new president comes in, they get sworn into office in January. Back then, they got sworn into office the next March. So there's like months and months and months and months. And we all knew that Roosevelt was the big president. But Hoover's still in the White House. Hoover's trying to work with Roosevelt. Hey, come up. Let's sit down. Let's talk. Let's work on some plans. Roosevelt's like, no. Roosevelt wanted it to get as bad as he could because as a politician, you want to be the guy that saved it. And I know that sounds kind of harsh, but it's absolutely true. Okay, so what happens is between November of 1932 and March of 33, the economy grinds to a virtual halt. It's as bad as it's going to get. 21st Amendment does get passed. That does repeal prohibition. So there's at least a little light at the end of the tunnel. But as a result of this, the inaugural dates do get moved to January because there's no sense in that much time elapsing because the electors vote in December. So there's no reason you can't do this in a month, not 3. So we've got ourselves a new president, and he's coming into office at probably the worst economic time in American history. And so what are the effects? By 32, early 33, unemployment somewhere in that 25 to 33%, but it's actually a little higher than 40. That's almost half. It's just a hair under half of Americans who are working age being out of work. Quarter of all the banks have failed. Quarter of the farmers have lost their farms. Thousands, tens of thousands of businesses have failed. And most people have lost a sense of their self-worth. And that's going to be part of the problem that Franklin Roosevelt has to face and one of the things that he has to fix. And boy, is he going to do it. One of my friends, she used to be the curator of the Eleanor Roosevelt papers, Eleanor being Franklin's wife. And she used to they said at this point in time that Franklin had to be Dr. Feelgood. And I'm always thinking about that Motley Crue song. He's the one that called Dr. Feelgood. He's the one that makes you feel all right. And that's all I can think of is Franklin Roosevelt singing with Motley Crue. But she's absolutely correct. He does have to make people feel good about themselves. That's the first step in fixing it. And then in 1941, he has to become Dr. Win the War. So one of these days, I may send this lecture to Alida Black, and she will smile hearing me say that. So that's what we've got as he takes office in 1933. Like I said, we're going to get a different lecture. I'll probably post it on Monday, but it is going to be about the Depression, the New Deal, and whether or not the New Deal actually ends or even lessens the Depression. All right, so thank y'all, and we'll see you on the other side.